is that one of the reasons the United States, whatever particular issue or country or challenge that we're facing, is seen as why the flag has a power, is that around the world, adversaries have traditionally, at least since the beginning of the 20th century, been scared of the United States, and allies and prospective allies have sought to align themselves with us. I say this as someone, as an American who grew up in London. My father was in the State Department. And it's very interesting in Europe, where you see a sort of casual anti-Americanism some of the time. But when you look at government policy, whether it be a liberal government or a conservative government in any of our major allies, and when you look at the military leadership, and when you look at business interests, the coalescence with the United States, or the desire to coalesce with the United States, is sustaining. And I think it is sustaining for the simple reason that when the sum of history and the comparative actions of the United States and other countries are put into play, people want to be with the United States. And I mention that because I think it's a useful foundation of the idea of what America stands for in the world when we look at more complicated issues. Take the Middle East at the moment. A lot of attention to do with Iran goes down to the nuclear program and in Iranian support for the Lebanese Hezbollah, their actions vis-a-vis Israel. But what we don't think about is why people in Lebanon, below the surface, want to align with the United States. And the simple reason for that is that a lot of American power, why we fight, is so that we don't have to fight. And that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but when we send American diplomats and military personnel, trainers, aid to a country, the longer we have people there, the more people come to trust the United States. And in Lebanon, below the surface, that matters because every day there is a battle for a democracy between Iranian-supported proxies and moderates from different political parties who are trying to find some form of coalescence. And the United States has played a critical role in Lebanon by being able to push the Iranians back. Sometimes that means killing them in back alleys. You need to do that with the Iranians sometimes, unfortunately. But a lot of the time, it simply means telling politicians that when they go out and try and petition to make the economy better, to introduce slow reforms, that the United States will have their back. And if not us, no one else will do it. And that's the simple fact. But of course, I think the extension to this is how do we learn from previous experiences? And certainly as someone who's, in Ben's generation, when we talk about that civic duty to think about why we fight, I think we all need to hold ourselves to a higher standard in terms of our approach to war and peace and to the decisions of war and peace. If we look at President Trump, someone who very fervently condemned the war in Iraq, said, what have we accomplished? And Republicans selected him as our candidate and elected him. That's fine. But we also selected and elected President George W. Bush in 2004 on the platform of doing everything that President Trump says was an utter failure. And the cost of that is the cost of young American lives and the wounds that American servicemen and women take in limbs and mind, and the families take. And I think it's something we have to bear more attention to when we have these debates. In terms of looking at the security environment now, where I want to sort of really focus here, it's not so much Russia, because Russia has been in the news. We will see what happens there. Perhaps there'll be questions on that. But China, I think China is a critical issue, considering what we do next. Because in my opinion, there is a better than 50-50 chance that in the next couple of years, the United States military will be involved in some form of overt conflict with the People's Republic of China. And I think that might be necessary. I think that might be something we have to fight for. But it's certainly something we need to pay a hell of a lot more attention to as a country, because it's flying below the surface. But let's consider it. What's happening with China at the moment? Well, in the South and East China Seas, which names are a bit deceptive, but if you look at a map, a lot of those waters are either international waters or peripheral to other states, Philippines, Vietnam. The Chinese are setting up artificial islands and weaponizing those islands so as to be able to create choke points through which a vast amount of international trade has to pass through essentially their dominion, and that they can shut that down and annihilate or cause immediate and serious harm to the global economy if they don't get their way. In many ways, it's similar to what Imperial Japan did in the 1930s. And in many ways, President Obama's policy towards China, in this specific sense, was similar to the policy of the European governments in the early part of the mid-1930s and the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi expansionism. And we've seen the legacy of history where, if people are not challenged, they will take acts counter to our interests. But in the case of China in the South and East China Seas, in the era of Trump, in the era of discussions about what has this got us, we should have the discussion to say perhaps America's role in the world is to step back, is to let China dominate those nations. And be under no illusions, it will include domination of Australia. It won't just be the Philippines and Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan. But it's a critical issue, and I tend to think if the United States stands for anything, it is the idea that in the long term, measured by strategic calculation that tries to mitigate the cost of war, again, on young men and women, but it is that we stand for certain ideals, and that we fight for that flag means something more than something we hold firm to as Americans nationally. It's an idea of freedom that people across the world unite behind. And when you look at what is happening now with China, trying to usurp the United States' position in that region of the world, my opinion is if they win there, if they are uncontested, what that will lead to is not simply a domination of the economic relations of that region and the rise of authoritarian governance and the submission or the subjugation of individual freedom, but over the longer term, it will have a gross effect in terms of the broader international framework that we have come to accept. America's relationship with difficult but close democracies in Europe, for example. And be under no illusions, the risks are great here. The British government already, and you can Google this, the Asia Investment and Infrastructure Bank, it's a Chinese, essentially, bribery scheme. They say, join our bank, pay fealty to the Chinese monarch, and in return, we will put tens of billions of dollars in investments into your economies. The British government, America's closest ally, is a member of that bank. Now, if that's what's happening now, what do you think would happen if the United States made the decision to withdraw? Would have profound implications for American economic interests, but more than that, it would have profound implications for the future of civil society, the future of our children or ourselves in terms of what world looks like going forwards. A much more authoritarian world, a world in which power through the barrel of a gun, as Mao used in one of his speeches, is the power that is defined, rather than American power through the barrel of a gun, but tempered to ideals that are sustaining and inherently good. And I think that is an issue that we have to also consider, is that American exceptionalism is a real and tangible thing. And too often, I think, as a country, we have made mistakes. We make mistakes. But if you compare what the United States has done for the world, and again, in standing up for interests at critical points, where, like China, in the near term, the costs of a conflict seem much higher than perhaps the step of simply saying, let's leave it. That international politics is complicated, but that the United States, the reason the world has been safe or has been better in an evolving track as America has grown more powerful, that individual wealth has risen, is because the United States has stood for ideals at critical junctures where issues have been complicated. Now, just to talk about China a little bit and what I think is going to happen here with the South and East China Sea, President Obama, Pacific Command, which essentially is dominated by the Navy, but the US military's Pacific Command, the commanders there wanted to send US Navy, carrier groups, destroyers, cruisers, proximate to these constructed Chinese islands. And I would encourage you to look at this on a map, because it is ludicrous how far away from China they are. But President Obama decided that he would do that occasionally, but it would be very quick passages, and it would be very tempered. I hope and suspect what President Trump will do is send 2 carrier strike groups through those areas and essentially go eyeball to eyeball with the Chinese and say, for the reasons I've articulated, but however President Trump says, I'm sure he can be more efficient with his use of words, that we are not going to let this stand. And I suspect that the power, as manifested by the skill of the United States military, but the potential capability of our ability essentially to deliver lethality. And the infantry, as Ben would attest, the objective of the infantry ultimately is by fire and maneuver to close with and destroy the enemy. The Chinese know that in the event of a conflict with the United States, that I don't think it would go nuclear, because quite frankly, it would be a catastrophe, but they know they would suffer a lot more than we would in that situation. And then when you get into nuclear doctrine, that's where it goes. It's unpleasant. But they know if they were involved in a naval contest, the United States Navy would inflict very serious harm on them, both for reasons of capability and skill. And that power would be real. And I also believe, and this is where the debate juncture comes, and we can have the questions, I also believe that that practice of tempered power, China is the example I'm using, but it applies equally in many other places, that where you are willing to go eyeball to eyeball and have trust in your ideals and in your capability and in your history as an informing element for both those 2 points, adversaries, bullies will back off. And if you don't do that, they will escalate. And of course, some people would say, let them escalate and let them take control. I would simply say, though, I think the cost of that too great. But all these interwoven issues, I think, are going to be much more on the radar than perhaps people think. And I seriously do think the China issue here is a really big one. I mean, it makes Iran look very small fry, and the Iranians are a real pain in the ass. So that's, saying something. Anyway.